The early Nigerian cultures. The NOK culture. Evidence of human occupation in Nigeria dates back thousands of years. The oldest fossil remains found by archaeologists in the southwestern area of Igbo Ukwu, near Akure, have been dated to about 9000 BCE. There are isolated collections of ancient tools and artifacts of different periods of the Stone Age, but the oldest recognizable evidence of an organized society belongs to the NOK culture, circa 500 BCE to circa 200 CE. Named for the village of NOK, site of some of the finds, the ancient culture produced fine terracotta figurines, which were accidentally discovered by tin miners on the Joseph Plateau in the 1930s. Initially Neolithic, New Stone Age, the NOK culture made the transition to the Iron Age. Its people raised crops and cattle and seemed to have paid particular attention to personal adornment, especially of the hair. Distinctive features of NOK art include naturalism, stylized treatment of the mouth and eyes, relative proportions of the human head, body, and feet, distortions of the human facial features, and treatment of animal forms. The spread of NOK-type figures in a wide area south of the Joseph Plateau, covering southern Kaduna State southeastward to Katsina, Alabama, south of the Benue River, suggests a well-established culture that left traces still identifiable in the lives of the peoples of the area today. Many of the distinctive features of NOK art can also be traced in later developments of Nigerian art produced in such places as Igbo Ukwu, Ife, Esi, and Benin City. Igbo Ukwu bronzes, which have been dated to about the 9th century CE, were discovered in the 1930s and 40s at Igbo Ukwu, near the southwestern city of Onitsha. See also African art. They reveal not only a high artistic tradition but also a well-structured society with wide-ranging economic relationships. Of particular interest is the source of the copper and lead used to make the bronzes, which may have been Tadmeka in the Sahara, and of the colored glass beads, some of which may have come from Venice and India, the latter via trade routes through Egypt, the Nile Valley, and the Chad Basin. It is believed that the bronzes were part of the furniture in the burial chamber of a high personage, possibly a forerunner of the Azenari, a priest-king, who held religious but not political power over large parts of the Igbo inhabited region well into the 20th century. Kingdoms and empires of pre-colonial Nigeria. Many indigenous polities emerged in Nigeria before the British took control in the late 19th century. In the north there were several large and developed systems, including the house estates of Kano, Katsina, Zaria, Engabur, Kanem-Borno, and the Jukun states of Kwara Rafa, Gona, Pinduga, and Wukari. Smaller kingdoms included those of the Igala, Nib, and Tabira. Notable in the south were the Yoruba states of Ife and Oyo, the Eto state of Benin, the Tsakiri state of Warri, the Efik state of Calabar, and the Ija city-states of Nemb, Elementary Kolabari, Bani, and Ikrika. Kanem-Borno. The history of Borno antedates the 9th century, when Arabic writers in North Africa first noted the kingdom of Kanem, east of Lake Chad. The lake was then much larger than the present-day body of water, and its basin attracted settlements and encouraged exchange. A pastoral group, ancestors of the Kanuri, established a centralized state over those referred to collectively as the Sao. Initially, trading links extended to the Nile Valley of Egypt. There is some evidence that Kanem had made contact with the Christian kingdoms of Nubia before it was overrun by Muslims, who gained a foothold in the ruling family of Kanem in the 11th century. From Kanem the rulers tried to dominate the areas south and west of the lake as well. By the 12th century they had been compelled by attacks from the Sound to move their capital to the region west of Lake Chad, and they gradually lost control of most of the original Kanem. For a long time, Borno was the dominant power in the central Sudan, including much of Hausaland. The Bayajida legend, concerning a mythical Middle Eastern ancestor of the Hausa, seems to suggest that the rise of a centralized political system in Hausaland was influenced from Borno. Though the rulers of Borno embraced Islam, the structure of the monarchy remained traditional, with the Queen Mother and other female officials exercising considerable power. The selection of the monarch, the coronation rites, and other bases of royal authority were dictated by pre-Islamic beliefs. The princes and other members of the royal family were granted fiefs and posted away from the capital to govern frontier zones, while people of slave origin were preferred for the royal guard and palace officials. Hausaland. For centuries the Hausa have occupied the northern plains beyond the Joseph Plateau, which were a crossroads open not only to Borno but also to the states of Mali and Songhai in the western Sudan, the trans-Saharan routes to northern Africa, and various trade routes to the forest areas of Borgu, Oyo, and Benin. Perhaps because of this strategic location, the Hausa developed a number of centralized states, such as Dora, Katsina, Kano, Zaria, Gibber, and, later, Kebbi, each with a walled city, a market center, and a monarchical system of government. Islam, which was introduced from the Mali Empire in the 14th century, strengthened both the monarchical system and the commercial contacts, but it remained predominantly an urban religion until the beginning of the 19th century. Even within the walled cities, however, some pre-Islamic rites remain part of the ceremonies that sustain monarchical authority. A considerable rivalry existed between the different states over agricultural land and the control of trade and trade routes, and Hausaland was periodically conquered by powerful neighbors such as Borno and Songhai. Yorubaland and Benin. Ife, which flourished between the 11th and 15th centuries, emerged as a major power in the forested areas west of the Niger and south of Hausaland. Some of the characteristic features of Yoruba culture emerged during that time: a monarchical system based on city-states and nucleated villages, a pantheon of gods, a few of which were recognized widely but with several local variations, and divination centered on the deity Ife, with its corpus of sacred chants. Ife is best known for its potsherd pavements and for the great artistry of its terracottas and bronzes, especially the naturalism of many of its bronze figures. See also African art. Ife's influence on surrounding states is evident in the fact that all the monarchies of Yoruba states claim descent from Ife as a way of establishing legitimacy, sometimes borrowing regalia from Ife to use in coronation rites and sometimes sending remains of deceased rulers to Ife for burial. Oyo, founded in the 14th century and located in the savannah to the north of the forest, gradually supplanted the older kingdom of Ife. After more than a century of struggle with nearby Borgu and Nuke, it established itself strategically as the emporium for exchanging goods from the north: rock salt, copper, textiles, leather goods, and horses, with products from the south: cola nuts, indigo, parrots, and cowries. By the 17th century it had built up a cavalry force with which it dominated people in western Yorubaland and in the dry gap to the coast. To the south, infestations of tsetse flies prevented kingdoms there from effectively utilizing horses. When the Portuguese arrived in the Kingdom of Benin in the 15th century, they found a monarchy, dating back many centuries, with a complex structure of chiefs and palace officials presiding over a kingdom that was expanding in all directions. In time, Benin dominated not only the Ato-speaking peoples to the north and south but also the area eastward to the Niger and, along the coast, to Lagos, which the Kato now claim to have founded, and even into present-day Ghana. It also exerted considerable influence on eastern Yorubaland and maintained trading connections with Oyo. Benin art, which began to flourish in the 15th century, was characterized by naturalistic bronze sculptures and bronze door panels that covered the outside of the royal palace. Igboland and the Delta city-states. Many Nigerian peoples did not develop centralized monarchical states. Of these, the Igbo were probably the most remarkable because of the size of their territory and the density of population. The Igbo characteristic decentralized society seems to have been a deliberate departure from the earlier traditions of NRI, monarchical institutions in such outlying cities as Asaba, Onitsha, and Aba probably arose through the influence of the kingdoms of Igbo and Benin. Igbo lineages were organized in self-contained villages or federations of village communities, with societies of elders and age-grade associations sharing various governmental functions. The same was true of the Idio of the Niger Delta and peoples of the Cross River area, where secret societies also played a prominent role in administration. Monarchical structures began to emerge by the 18th century in response to the needs of the overseas trade. Initially, Portuguese contacts focused on Benin and Buhari. By the 17th and 18th centuries, at the height of the slave trade, the Delta city-states had become the principal outlets of that activity. Various coastal communities organized themselves as entrepots of the slave trade, so that they would not also become its victims. Similarly, the Igbo, like the Benin and Yoruba kingdoms, supplied slaves to the coast, although Benin had largely ended its involvement in the Atlantic slave trade by the 18th century. The deleterious effect of the slave trade on the society and the economy was felt everywhere, but, in terms of loss of population, those who suffered most appear to have been the non-centralized peoples of the Middle Belt. The trade also caused severe economic and political dislocations, intercommunal rivalries, and the forced migrations of millions of people out of Nigeria. The Sokoto jihad. At the beginning of the 19th century, Islam was well established at all the major centers of the Hausa states in Borno. The Etsu, ruler of Nupe, accepted Islam, and a few teachers and itinerant preachers were also known in parts of the Oyo Empire. A group of Muslim intellectuals, most of them Fulani led by Usman Dan Fodio, were unhappy that in all these places the rulers allowed the practice of Islam to be mixed with aspects of traditional religion and that nowhere was Islamic law, the Sharia, observed in full. After 20 years of writing, teaching, and preaching in Gabar and surrounding states, Shu, meaning chief or senior, Usman, as he was now called, withdrew his followers to Gudu, where they formally proclaimed him Amir al-Mu'minin, commander of the faithful, pledged their loyalty, and prepared for war. In 1804 he called on his followers and all lovers of true Islam to rise up and overthrow the unjust rulers. He appealed to the masses of slaves and to the pastoral Fulani as oppressed people to join the revolt. The high degree of communication that existed at this time among the different peoples in the area that would become Nigeria was evidenced when the call to jihad, struggle or battle made in Gudu, in the northwest, had repercussions throughout the entire area comprising the present-day country. As a result of the considerable interaction along trade routes and rivers draining the northern plains to the Niger-Benue Valley, through the delta, and across the coastal lagoons, the call to jihad was answered not only in the Hausa states, such as Kano, Katsina, and Zaria, but also in Borno, Bauchi, Gom, and Adamawa and eventually in Nib, Alolan, and other places where there were pockets of Fulani scholars. Thus was created a caliphate, with its seat at the newly established town of Sokoto. Each emirate enjoyed autonomy but pledged loyalty to the Amir al-Mu'minin and made contributions for the upkeep of Sokoto. Disputes within or between emirates were referred to Sokoto for settlement by officials who traveled as often as possible to oversee developments. Usman himself retired in 1811 to concentrate on the intellectual direction of the movement, which followed the teachings of the Qadiri Brotherhood and strict adherence to the Maliki Code of Laws. His brother Abdullahi and his son Muhammad Bello carried on the jihad and laid the basis of administration. When Usman died in 1817, Muhammad Bello succeeded him as Emir al-Mu'minin, while Abdullah, as Emir of Kanem-Borno, was given charge of the Western Emirates, notably Nupe and Ilorin. In this way, all the Hausa states, parts of Borno, Nupe, Ilorin, and Fulani outposts in Bauchi and Adamawa were drawn into a single politico-religious system. The rulers of Borno invited Sheikh Muhammad al-Amin al-Kaimi, a distinguished scholar and statesman who disagreed with the Fulani view that jihad was an acceptable tool against backsliding Muslims, to lead their defense of Borno against the Fulani jihad. In the process, Islam was revived in Borno, and the old Safawa dynasty was eventually replaced by that of Shah Muhammad al-Kaimi. The collapse of Oyo. Although the Fulani intrusion into Ilorin largely contributed to the collapse of the Oyo Empire, it was not the only cause. Deep-seated conflicts arose between the Ilafan, or ruler, and his chiefs, including both provincial rulers and lineage chiefs and councillors at the capital. In spite of the external threat from the Fulani and others, the conflicts could not be resolved. Fulani ascendancy at Ilorin cut off the supply of horses to Oyo and made the defense of the capital untenable. Large groups of people from Oyo had to migrate southward, where they established a new capital, at present-day Oyo, and other centers such as Ibadan and IJ. This pressure, in turn, pushed the Igbo farther south, where they founded the town of Abeokuta about 1830. The collapse of the Oyo Empire unleashed a major redistribution of the Yoruba people and precipitated a series of Yoruba wars that lasted until 1886. The arrival of the British. The Sokoto jihad and the Yoruba wars stimulated the slave trade at a time when the British were actively trying to stop it. Slaves formerly had been traded for European goods, especially guns and gunpowder, but now the British encouraged trade in palm oil in the Niger Delta states, ostensibly to replace the trade in slaves. They later discovered that the demand for palm oil was in fact stimulating an internal slave trade, because slaves were largely responsible for collecting palm fruits, manufacturing palm oil, and transporting it to the coast, whether by canoe or by human over the ridge. The palm oil trade was also linked to the Sokoto jihad and the Yoruba wars, because many warriors recognized the importance of slaves not only as soldiers and producers of food to feed soldiers but additionally as producers of palm oil to trade for European Dane guns and other goods. Many of the slaves exported in the 1820s and 30s were intercepted by the ships of the Royal Navy, emancipated, and deposited in Sierra Leone under missionary tutelage. Some of them began to migrate back from Sierra Leone in search of home and trade. They invited missionaries to follow them and, in the 1840s, made themselves available as agents who allowed missionaries and British traders to gain access to such places as Lagos, Abeokuta, Calabar, Lokoja, Onitsha, Grass, and Bonny. In 1841 the British tried to settle some Igbo on a model farm in Lokoja, but the plan was aborted because the mortality rate among European officials was so high. It was also partly to protect the Igbo that the British shelled Lagos in 1851, expelled Kozoko, the reigning Oba, and restored his uncle, Akita, who appeared more willing to join in a campaign to abolish the slave trade. The British annexed Lagos in 1861 in order to protect Akita's son and successor, foil Kozoko's bid to return, and secure a base for further activities. The British were not yet willing to assume the expense of maintaining an administration in Nigeria. To reduce costs, Lagos was administered first from Freetown in Sierra Leone, along with Gold Coast forts such as Elmina, and later from Accra, in present-day Ghana. Only in 1886 did Lagos become a separate colony. A consul was maintained at Fernando Po to oversee the lucrative palm oil trade in the region called the Oil Rivers. Missionaries were active, Presbyterians in Calabar and the Church Missionary Society, CMS, Methodists, and Baptists in Lagos, Abeokuta, Ibadan, Oyo, and Ogbonso. The CMS pioneered trade on the Niger by encouraging Scottish explorer and merchant MacGregor Laird to run a monthly steamboat, which provided transportation for missionary agents and Sierra Leonean traders going up the Niger. In this way Bishop Samuel J.E. Crowther, born in the Yoruba-inhabited area of Oshogbo and the first African ordained by the CMS, was able to establish mission stations at Onitsha, Lokoja, and Egan and later at Brass and Bonny. By the 1870s the Niger trade was becoming profitable, and a few French companies took notice. French Roman Catholic missionaries, established in Haida, arrived in Lagos and considered missionary work on the Niger. The British responded to such evidence of rivalry by defending their right to free navigation on the river at the Berlin West Africa Conference of 1884–85. At the same time, George Dashwood Goldie, a British businessman, bought out all French rivals and created the Royal Niger Company, chartered 1886, in order to control trade on the Niger and administer the immense territories of the Sokoto Caliphate and Borno. In addition, two other protectorates were declared, one over the oil rivers and the other over the hinterland of Lagos, to establish a claim that these areas were also British spheres of interest. The boundaries of the two protectorates and the territories of the Royal Niger Company were difficult to define, but the tension was eased in 1894 when both entities were merged into the Niger Coast Protectorate. Rivalry between the Royal Niger Company and the Lagos Protectorate over the boundary between the Emirate of Igboland and the Empire of Ibadan was resolved with the abrogation of the charter of the Royal Niger Company on January 1, 1900, in return for wide mineral concessions. In the north Frederick Lugard, the first High Commissioner of Northern Nigeria, was instrumental in subjugating the Fulani emirs. Some were deposed, some were defeated in battle, and others collaborated. By 1903 the conquest of the Emirates was complete. The mud-walled city of Kano was captured in February, and, after a vigorous skirmish at Kwashi, the Sultan's capital, Sokoto, fell the next month. All the territories were now under British control, and the search for an identity began, first as northern and southern Nigeria and then with eventual amalgamation. The British penetration of Nigeria met with various forms of resistance throughout the country. In the south the British had to fight many wars, in particular the wars against the Igbo, a Yoruba group, in 1892, the Aro of eastern Igboland, and, until 1914, the Anioka of western Igboland. In the north many emirates did not take military action, but the deposed Caliph, Atahiru I, rebelled in 1903. Many Muslims resorted to migration as a form of resistance, a tactic known as the Hijra, in which those perceived as infidels are avoided. Resistance was strong in western Igboland, where a series of wars were waged against the British. The Ikumeku, who were well organized and whose leaders were joined in secrecy oaths, effectively utilized guerrilla tactics to attack the British. Their forces, which were drawn from hundreds of Igbo youth from all parts of the region, created many problems for the British, but the British used forceful tactics and heavy armaments, destroying homes, farms, and roads, to prevail. The Ikumeku, however, became a great source of Igbo nationalism. Nigeria as a colony. After the British government assumed direct control of the Royal Niger Company's territories, the northern areas were renamed the Protectorate of Northern Nigeria, and the land in the Niger Delta and along the lower reaches of the river was added to the Niger Coast Protectorate, which was renamed the Protectorate of Southern Nigeria. Lagos remained the capital of the south, with Zanjuru the new capital of the north. On January 1, 1914, following the recommendations of Sir Frederick Lugard, the two protectorates were amalgamated to form the Colony and Protectorate of Nigeria under a single Governor-General resident in Lagos. Between 1919 and 1954 the title reverted to Governor. Following Lugard's success in the north, He set out the principles of the administrative system subsequently institutionalized as indirect rule. Essentially, local government was to be left in the hands of the traditional chiefs, subject to the guidance of European officers. Native institutions were utilized and interference with local customs kept to a minimum, although the British did not always understand the local customs. While this system had built-in contradictions, over the years the Nigerian system developed into a sophisticated form of local government, especially in the Emirates and under the banner of native administration, which became the hallmark of British colonial rule in Africa. Many changes accompanied British rule. Western education, the English language, and Christianity spread during the period. New forms of money, transportation, and communication were developed, and the Nigerian economy became based on the export of cash crops. Areas with lucrative crops such as cocoa and peanuts, groundnuts, profited, while many people in different parts of the country had to migrate to work elsewhere as tenant farmers or use their newly acquired education and skills to work in cities as wage earners, traders, and artisans. Two tiers of government emerged, central and local. The central government, presided over by the Governor-General and accountable to the Secretary for the Colonies in London, was more powerful but distant from the people. Local administration, where the colonial citizens typically experienced colonial authority, was based on the policy of indirect rule first developed in the north. To prevent any united opposition to its authority, the British adopted a divide-and-rule policy, keeping Nigerian groups separate from one another as much as possible. Traditional authorities were co-opted in the north, where the spread of Western education by Christian missionaries was strongly resisted by Muslim leaders. In the south the British occasionally created a political hierarchy where there had been none before. In most cases they ruled through those who were most malleable, whether these people had held traditional positions of authority or not. Because Western education and Christianity spread rapidly in the south and not in the north, development was much slower in the north, and a growing disparity between north and south later caused political tensions. Further dislocation accompanied the outbreak of World War I. Locally this involved the immediate invasion of the German-held Cameroon by Nigerian forces, followed by a costly campaign that lasted until 1916. Later Nigerian troops were sent to East Africa. During World War II they again served in East Africa, as well as in Burma, now Myanmar. In 1922 Cameroon was divided under a League of Nations mandate between France and Britain administering its area within the government of Nigeria. After 1946 the mandated areas were redesignated as a United Nations, UN, trust territory. Although colonial rule appeared secure in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the British struggled to keep control of their Nigerian colony and continued to do so until Nigeria became independent in 1960. The British, when faced with dissent, tended to grant political reforms in an effort to dispel the attractiveness of more radical suggestions. Early on in colonial rule, for example, Nigerians protested the manner in which water rates and head taxes were collected. Nigerians also requested more political representation. The Nigerian Legislative Council was established in 1914 and was given limited jurisdiction. It was replaced in 1922 by a larger one that included elected members from Lagos and Calabar, although its powers also were limited and the northern provinces remained outside its control. A more representative system did not appear until 1946, when each geographic group of provinces had its own House of Assembly, with the majority of non-official, though not yet all elected, members. There were also a House of Chiefs and, in Lagos, a Central Legislative Council. By 1919 the National Council of British West Africa, an organization consisting of elites across West Africa, was demanding that half the members of the Legislative Council be Africans. They also wanted a university in West Africa and more senior positions for Africans in the colonial civil service. Beginning in the 1920s, a number of Nigerians joined other blacks in various parts of the world to embark on the wider project of Pan-Africanism, which sought to liberate black people from racism and European domination. In 1923, Herbert Macaulay, the grandson of Samuel J.E. Crowther, established the first Nigerian political party, the Nigerian National Democratic Party, which successfully contested 3 Lagos seats in the Legislative Council. Macaulay was despised by the British, but he came to be regarded as the father of modern Nigerian nationalism. After the 1930s, political activities focused primarily on ways to end British rule. A national party, the Nigerian Youth Movement, emerged in 1934, and its members won elections to the Legislative Council. After 1940, political activities were broadened to include more people. In 1944, Macaulay and Nnamdi Azikiwe, an Igbo who had been educated in the United States, united more than 40 different groups to establish the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons, NCNC. The forces unleashed against the British were now diverse, including soldiers who had served in World War II, the media, restless youth, market women, educated people, and farmers, all of whom became committed to the anti-colonial movement. Political leaders resorted to the use of political parties and the media to mobilize millions of Nigerians against the continuation of British rule. The British answered this activity by attempting to create a more representational colonial system. The Macpherson Constitution, promulgated in 1951, provided for a central House of Representatives, but friction between the central and regional legislatures, related to the question of where Supreme Party authority lay, soon caused a breakdown. In response to Azikiwe and other nationalists, the Littleton Constitution of 1954 created a fully federal system, comprising the 3 geographic regions of Nigeria, the Southern Cameroons, and the Federal Territory of Lagos. Each region had a governor, premier, cabinet, legislature, and civil service, with the significantly weaker federal government represented in Lagos by a governor-general, bureaucracy, House of Representatives, and Senate. The Southern Protectorate was divided into 2 provinces in 1939, Western and Eastern, and in 1954 they, along with the Northern Protectorate, were renamed the Western, Eastern, and Northern regions as part of Nigeria's reconstruction into a federal state. Internal self-government was granted to the Western and Eastern regions in 1957. The Eastern region was dominated by Azikiwe and the Western one by Chief Obafemi Awolowo, a Yoruba lawyer who in 1950 founded the Action Group. Demanding immediate self-government, the Action Group was opposed by the Northern People's Congress, NPC, which was composed largely of Northerners and headed by several leaders, including Abubakar Tafawa Balewa. At its own request, the Northern region was not given internal self-government until 1959, because Northerners feared that the region might lose its claim to an equal share in the operation and opportunities of the federal government if it was not given time to catch up with the educationally advanced South. Among the problems needing attention before the British would grant full independence was the minorities' fear of discrimination by a future government based on majority ethnic groups. After the Willing Commission examined and reported on this issue in 1958, independence was granted. Independent Nigeria. Nigeria was granted independence on October 1, 1960. A new constitution established a federal system with an elected prime minister and a ceremonial head of state. The NCNC, now headed by Azikiwe, who had taken control after Macaulay's death in 1946, formed a coalition with Balewa's NPC after neither party won a majority in the 1959 elections. Balewa continued to serve as the Prime Minister, a position he had held since 1957, while Azikiwe took the largely ceremonial position of President of the Senate. Following a UN-supervised referendum, The northern part of the Trust Territory of the Cameroons joined the northern region in June 1961, while in October the southern Cameroons united with Cameroon to form the Federal Republic of Cameroon. On October 1, 1963, Nigeria became a republic. Azikiwe became president of the country, although as Prime Minister Yar'Adua was still more powerful. After a brief honeymoon period, Nigeria's long-standing regional stresses, caused by ethnic competitiveness, educational inequality, and economic imbalance, again came to the fore in the controversial census of 1962 to 1963. In an attempt to stave off ethnic conflict, the Midwest region was created in August 1963 by dividing the Western region. Despite this division, the country still was segmented into three large geographic regions, each of which was essentially controlled by an ethnic group, the West by the Yoruba, the East by the Igbo, and the North by the House of Fulani. Conflicts were endemic. As regional leaders protected their privileges, the South complained of Northern domination, and the North feared that the Southern elite was bent on capturing power. In the West the government had fallen apart in 1962, and a boycott of the federal election of December 1964 brought the country to the brink of breakdown. The point of no return was reached in January 1966, when, after the collapse of order in the West following the fraudulent election of October 1965, a group of army officers attempted to overthrow the federal government, and Prime Minister Yar'Adua and two of the regional premiers were murdered. A military administration was set up under Major General Johnson Igbo, but his plan to abolish the regions and impose a unitary government met with anti-Igbo riots in the north. The military intervention worsened the political situation, as the army itself split along ethnic lines, its officers clashed over power, and the instigators and leaders of the January coup were accused of favoring Igbo domination. In July 1966 northern officers staged a counter-coup, Igbo was assassinated, and Lieutenant Colonel, later General, Yakubu Gowon came to power. The crisis was compounded by intercommunal clashes in the north and threats of secession in the south. Gowon's attempt to hold a conference to settle the constitutional future of Nigeria was abandoned after a series of ethnic massacres in October. A last-ditch effort to save the country was made in January 1967, when the Eastern delegation, led by Lieutenant Colonel, later General, Odumegwu Ojukwu, agreed to meet the others on neutral ground at Aburi, Ghana, but the situation deteriorated after differences developed over the interpretation of the accord. In May the Eastern Region's Consultative Assembly authorized Ojukwu to establish a sovereign republic, while, at the same time, the federal military government promulgated a decree dividing the four regions into 12 states, including 6 in the north and 3 in the east, in an attempt to break the power of the regions. The Civil War. On May 30, 1967, Ojukwu declared the secession of the three states of the eastern region under the name of the Republic of Biafra, which the federal government interpreted as an act of rebellion. Fighting broke out in early July and within weeks had escalated into a full-scale civil war. In August Biafran troops crossed the Niger, seized Benin City, and were well on their way to Lagos before they were checked at Horn, a small town in western state, now Ondo State. Shortly thereafter, federal troops entered Enugu, the provisional capital of Biafra, and penetrated the Igbo heartland. The next 2 years were marked by stiff resistance in the shrinking Biafran enclave and by heavy casualties among civilians as well as in both armies, all set within what threatened to be a military stalemate. Peacemaking attempts by the Organization of African Unity, now the African Union, remained ineffective, while Biafra began earning recognition from African states and securing aid from international organizations for what was by then a starving population. The final Biafran collapse began on December 24, 1969, when federal troops launched a massive effort at a time when Biafra was short on ammunition, its people were desperate for food, and its leaders controlled only 1/6 of the territory that had formed the Biafran Republic in 1967. Ojukwu fled to Côte d'Ivoire on January 11, 1970, and a Biafran deputation formally surrendered in Lagos 4 days later. General Gowon was able, through his own personal magnetism, to reconcile the two sides so that the former Biafran states were integrated into the country once again and were not blamed for the war. The oil boom that followed the war allowed the federal government to finance development programs and consolidate its power. In 1974, Gowon postponed until 1976 the target date for a return to civilian rule, but he was overthrown in July 1975 and fled to Great Britain. The new head of state, Brigadier General Murtala Ramad Mohammed, initiated many changes during his brief time in office. He began the process of moving the federal capital to Abuja, addressed the issue of government inefficiency, and, most important, initiated the process for a return to civilian rule. He was assassinated in February 1976 during an unsuccessful coup attempt, and his top aide, Lieutenant General Olusegun Obasanjo, became head of the government. The Second Republic. Obasanjo pursued Mohammed's desire to return the country to civilian rule. As a first step, a new constitution was promulgated that replaced the British-style parliamentary system with a presidential one. The president was invested with greater power but could assume office only after winning 1/4 of the votes in 2/3 of the states in the federation. Many political parties emerged, but only 5 were registered: the National Party of Nigeria, NPN, the Unity Party of Nigeria, the People's Redemption Party, PRP, the Great Nigeria People's Party, and the Nigeria People's Party. All promised to improve education and social services, provide welfare, rebuild the economy and support private industry, and pursue a radical, anti-imperialist foreign policy. The PRP was notable for expressing socialist ideas and rhetoric. Shashagari, the candidate of the dominant party, the right-wing NPN, narrowly won the 1979 presidential election, defeating Chief Obafemi Awolowo. The NPN's party leaders used political power as an opportunity to gain access to public treasuries and distribute privileges to their followers. Members of the public were angry, and many openly challenged the relevance of a democracy that could not produce leaders who would improve their lives and provide moral authority. Even in this climate, however, Shagari was re-elected president in August to September 1983, although his landslide victory was attributed to gross voting irregularities. Shagari was not able to manage the political crisis that followed or to end Nigeria's continuing economic decline, and the military seized the opportunity to stage a coup on December 31, 1983, that brought Major General Muhammad Buhari to power. Military regimes, 1983 to 1999. Buhari justified his coup and subsequent actions by citing the troubles of the Second Republic and the declining economy. The regime declared a war against indiscipline, WAI, which resulted in the arrest, detention, and jailing of a number of politicians. When the way was extended to journalists and others not responsible for the social decay and economic problems, the government's popularity began to wane. General Ibrahim Babangida assumed power following a bloodless coup in August 1985. Babangida at first presented to the public and the media the image of an affectionate and considerate leader. He released political detainees and promised that public opinion would influence his decisions and those of the Armed Forces Ruling Council, the supreme governing body. The public, however, demanded an end to military rule. Babangida outwardly supported the return to civilian government but worked to undermine the process in order to retain power. A transition program was announced in 1986 that was to terminate in 1990, later extended to 1993, and the military controlled the process. The government created two political parties, the Social Democratic Party, SDP, and the National Republican Convention, NRC, and produced their agendas for them. Freely formed parties were not registered, and many politicians were banned from politics. The 1979 Constitution was modified by a Constituent Assembly, and a series of elections were then held for local government councillors, state governors, and legislatures. Although Babangida avoided presidential primary elections held in 1992, and all the candidates were banned from politics, a presidential election was slated for June 1993 between two pro-government candidates, Chief MKO Abiola of the SDP and Alhaji Bashir Tofa of the NRC. The Babangida government believed that the elections would never take place and felt that, even if they did, the North-South divide would lead to a stalemate, as Abiola came from the south and Tofa from the north. Contrary to government expectation, however, the election was held on schedule, and it was free, fair, and peaceful. Chief Abiola won, but Babangida annulled the results before they became official. This turned out to be a serious miscalculation that forced him out of power in August 1993, and an interim national government, ING, was instituted, led by Yoruba businessman Ernest Chong. The ING faced opposition from all sides, and General Sani Abacha, the defense minister under Babangida, overthrew it in November, reinstating military rule. Like Babangida, he promised a transition to civilian rule while pursuing the means to maintain power, but, unlike Babangida, he used excessive force to attain his ambition. If the political future of Nigeria appeared bright with the victory of Chief Abiola in June 1993, Abacha's seizure of power and subsequent rule reversed most of the gains that the country had made since 1960. At no time since the mid-1960s did so many question the existence of Nigeria as a political entity. When leading politicians did not call for the breakup of the country, they advocated a confederacy with a weakened center and even a divided army and police force. Opposition forces called for a national conference to renegotiate the basis of Nigerian unity. The country's international image was damaged, as it suffered serious condemnation and isolation. The Abacha regime ignored due process of law, press freedom, individual liberty, and human rights. The government used violence as a weapon against its opponents and critics. When Abiola proclaimed himself president, he was arrested in June 1994 and died in jail in 1998. Trade union movements were suspended and protesters were killed, yet opposition to the government, particularly outside of the country, did not abate. Abacha and his loyalists again used the state as an instrument of personal gain. The decisive turning point in military disengagement came with Abacha's sudden death in June 1998. General Abdul Salam Abubakar, appointed to replace him, promised to transfer power to civilians. He freed political prisoners, ended the harassment of political opponents, and set forth the timetable for the transition to civilian rule. The country's international image improved, but economic performance remained sluggish. Return to civilian rule. The 1999 elections. After Abacha's death, political activity blossomed as numerous parties were formed. Of these, 3 emerged that were able to contest elections: the People's Democratic Party, PDP, the Alliance for Democracy, and the All People's Party. A series of elections were held in January to March 1999 in which councillors for local governments, legislatures for state and federal assemblies, and state governors were selected. The presidential election took place in February and was carefully monitored by an international team of observers. Olusegun Obasanjo of the PDP, who as head of state in 1976 to 1979 had overseen the last transition from military rule, was declared the winner. Nigeria under Olusegun Obasanjo. Obasanjo was sworn in on May 29, 1999. A new constitution was also promulgated that month. Nigerians, tired of prolonged and crisis-prone military regimes, welcomed the change of government, as did the international community. In the first civilian-administered elections since the country achieved independence in 1960, Obasanjo was re-elected in 2003, although there were widespread reports of voting irregularities. Domestic unrest and insecurity. Although conditions in Nigeria were generally improved under Obasanjo, there was still considerable strife within the country. Ethnic conflict, previously kept in check during the periods of military rule, now erupted in various parts of Nigeria, and friction increased between Muslims and Christians when some of the northern and central states chose to adopt Islamic law, the Sharia. Demonstrations were held to protest the government's soil policies and high fuel prices. Residents of the Niger Delta also protested the operations of petroleum companies in their area, asserting that the companies exploited their land while not providing a reasonable share of the petroleum profits in return. Their protests evolved into coordinated militant action in 2006. Petroleum companies were targeted, their employees were kidnapped, and refineries and pipelines were damaged as militants attempted to disrupt oil production and inflict economic loss. The Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta, MEND, was the most active of such militant groups, although its activity decreased after the group declared a unilateral ceasefire, and the government introduced an amnesty program in 2009. Bakassi Peninsula dispute. Obasanjo was also faced with resolving an ongoing border dispute with neighboring Cameroon that included the question of which country had rights to the Bakassi Peninsula, an oil-rich area to which both countries had strong cultural ties. Under the terms of a 2002 International Court of Justice ruling, the region was awarded to Cameroon, and Obasanjo was criticized by the international community when Nigeria did not immediately comply by withdrawing its troops from the area in the subsequent years. He also received much domestic criticism for contemplating withdrawal from the peninsula by those who questioned the fate of the large number of Nigerians living in the region and cited the long-standing cultural ties between the Bakassi Peninsula and Nigeria. Nevertheless, Obasanjo eventually honored the terms of the ruling in 2006 when Nigeria relinquished its claim to the peninsula and withdrew its forces. The process of transferring the peninsula to Cameroon was not without its problems, including the ongoing issue of resettling Nigerians displaced by the transfer and the dissatisfaction of those who remained but were now under Cameroonian rule. In November 2007, Nigeria's Senate voted to void the agreement that had ceded the Bakassi Peninsula to Cameroon. However, this action did not affect the actual status of the peninsula, and a ceremony held on August 14, 2008, marked the completion of the peninsula's transfer from Nigeria to Cameroon. Controversies surrounding the 2007 presidential election. Meanwhile, Obasanjo was the subject of domestic and international criticism for his attempt to amend the constitution to allow him to stand for a third term as president. The proposed amendment was rejected by the Senate in 2006. With Obasanjo unable to contest the election, Umaru Musa Yar'Adua was selected to stand as the PDP's candidate in the April 2007 presidential poll. He was declared the winner, but international observers strongly condemned the election as being marred by voting irregularities and fraud. Nonetheless, Yar'Adua was sworn in as president on May 29, 2007. Yar'Adua's ill health. Yar'Adua's health was the subject of rumors, as he had traveled abroad for medical treatment several times in the years prior to his presidency and continued to do so after the election. His ability to serve as president while dealing with health issues was called into question after he went to Saudi Arabia in late November 2009 for treatment of heart problems and kidney problems. After he had been absent from Nigeria for several weeks, critics complained of a power vacuum in the country, and there were calls for Yar'Adua to formally transfer power to the vice president, Goodluck Jonathan. Although a ruling by a Nigerian court on January 29, 2010, indicated that Yar'Adua was not obligated to hand over power to the vice president while he was out of the country for medical treatment, the controversy surrounding his prolonged absence remained. On February 9, 2010, the National Assembly voted to have Jonathan assume full power and serve as acting president until Yar'Adua was able to resume his duties. Jonathan agreed and assumed power later that day, but it was unclear whether or not the assumption of power was constitutional. When Yar'Adua returned to Nigeria on February 24, 2010, it was announced that Jonathan would remain as acting president while Yar'Adua continued to recuperate. Yar'Adua never fully recovered, however, and he died on May 5, 2010. Jonathan was sworn in as president the following day. Jonathan's priorities for the rest of his term included tackling corruption, dealing with the country's energy problems, and continuing his involvement in peace negotiations with rebels in the Niger Delta, something he had focused on while he was vice president. The 2011 elections. Another area of focus cited by Jonathan was the reformation of the electoral process. Noting the irregularities associated with the 2007 presidential election, he vowed to make fair and transparent elections a priority, beginning with those scheduled for 2011. Voting in Nigeria's legislative elections began on April 2, 2011, but, because necessary electoral materials were not available in some areas, voting was halted and postponed until April 9, April 26 in some locations. As a result, the presidential election that was scheduled for April 9 was delayed until April 16. Jonathan was the overwhelming winner of the presidential election, receiving almost 59% of the vote among a field of 19 other challengers. Former military leader and head of state Muhammadu Buhari placed second, with about 32% of the vote. In other elections, the PDP did not fare as well as in previous years, but it managed to maintain control of the legislature and a majority of state governorship posts. International observers praised the elections as being largely free and fair. The polls were not completely without violence or controversy, however, as supporters of Buhari and other losing candidates rioted, primarily in the north, and accused the ruling PDP of electoral fraud. Rise of Boko Haram. Among the most pressing concerns in Jonathan's first full term as president was the ongoing threat presented by Boko Haram, an Islamic sectarian movement founded in 2002 in northeastern Nigeria. The group claimed to want to end the corruption and injustice in the country and impose Sharia, or Islamic law. Boko Haram did not gain widespread notoriety until 2009 when, after an altercation with military and local police forces, it began attacking police and government targets, killing and injuring many. In response, security forces launched a crackdown on the group, killing many members. Shortly thereafter, the group's leader, Muhammad Yusuf, was captured and killed while in police custody, as were several of his followers. After a hiatus, the group resurfaced under the leadership of Yusuf's deputy, Abubakar Shekau, and unleashed a campaign of violence in 2010 that continued in the following years. Boko Haram's attacks grew in intensity and frequency, occurring primarily in northeastern and central Nigeria and typically targeting government buildings, military barracks, the police, and Christian churches and schools. extrajudicial violence and killings by the police and military while in the pursuit of the group's members were not uncommon and further heightened tensions in the country. The extrajudicial activity was also widely condemned by human rights groups. In 2012, some estimates held that more than 2,800 people had been killed by Boko Haram or by the security forces pursuing the group. The idea of granting amnesty to the group members if they disarmed, similar to what had been done with the Men rebels in 2009, had been periodically proposed but dismissed for various reasons. In April 2013, however, with Boko Haram's violence showing little sign of abatement and the previous strategies of dealing with the group by force clearly proven ineffective, Jonathan appointed a committee to investigate the implementation of an amnesty program, but it bore little fruit. In June, Jonathan officially declared Boko Haram a terrorist group and banned it under Nigerian law. The militants and anyone caught helping them could then be prosecuted under the country's Terrorism Prevention Act, which was expected to facilitate legal prosecution of the accused. Boko Haram's attacks continued throughout the rest of 2013 and into 2014, with the government unable to do much to stop the group. In April 2014, Boko Haram's mass kidnapping of more than 275 girls from a boarding school in Chibok and Borno State brought the group and its unabated campaign of terror into the international spotlight. The kidnapping was widely condemned across the globe and generated an increase in offers of international assistance to Nigeria, which, unlike in the past, the country was now more willing to accept. Neighboring countries as well as Western nations worked with Nigeria to curtail the group's actions and to try to locate the missing schoolgirls. The next month, the UN Security Council imposed sanctions on individuals in Boko Haram, freezing assets and issuing travel bans and an arms embargo, but, given the nature of the group's operations, it was unclear if the sanctions would actually have an impact on Boko Haram's activities. They did not. The group's attacks continued, and in August Boko Haram declared the areas under its control to be an Islamic State. The 2015 elections and electorate concerns. The government's inability to eliminate the threat from Boko Haram was one of the key issues in the run-up to the 2015 presidential and legislative elections, along with the economy and the persistent complaint of corruption. Economic progress was mixed. Nigeria's economy grew to be the continent's largest in 2014, but the oil-reliant economy also experienced sharp decline later that year because of plunging oil prices on the world market. Also, despite overall economic growth during Jonathan's term, many Nigerians, especially those in rural areas and in the north, lived in poverty. The elections had originally been scheduled for mid-February, but the country's electoral commission postponed them for 6 weeks, citing the current level of violence from Boko Haram in the northeast as an impediment to holding elections there. Jonathan, who had been criticized along with the military for not doing enough to combat Boko Haram, accepted assistance from the neighboring countries of Benin, Cameroon, Chad, and Niger. Plans were made for a regional force comprising troops from Nigeria and the aforementioned countries, and an offensive was launched against the militants. Marked progress was made in the fight against Boko Haram, with forces retaking much of the area previously held by the group. Although there were 14 candidates standing in the March 28, 2015, presidential election, the real contest was seen as being between Jonathan, once again the PDP candidate, and Buhari, the former military head of state, 1984 to 1985, who was the All Progressives Congress, APC, candidate and enjoyed a reputation as being tough on corruption and adept at handling security issues. The election was the most closely contested ever in Nigeria. When it became clear that Buhari had won the election, Jonathan conceded. The election marked the first time that an incumbent had been defeated and power would be handed from one party to another. Buhari was inaugurated on May 29, 2015. Nigeria under Buhari. Recession, fight against corruption, and insecurity. Buhari faced several challenges as president. In 2016, declining oil revenue led to Nigeria's first recession in more than 25 years. Although some recovery progress was evident by 2018, many Nigerian citizens did not see relief, and the country earned the unenviable distinction that year of having the most people in extreme poverty in the world. Many questioned whether Buhari was fit enough to serve as president, as he repeatedly left the country for medical treatment of an undisclosed ailment. In 2017 he was absent for several months. There was progress in the fight against corruption, but it was accompanied by criticism that efforts were focused on members of the opposition while ignoring the corrupt activities of APC allies. Meanwhile, in early March 2015 Boko Haram pledged allegiance to the Islamic State in Iraq and Levant, ISIL, and took the name Islamic State, or States, West African Province, ISWAP, later more commonly known as Islamic State in West Africa, or ISWA. The next year the group experienced a schism, with one faction retaining that name and the other reverting back to the original appellation. Although the military had made progress against Boko Haram and ISWA by late 2016, attacks later resumed, crushing hopes that the militants would soon be eradicated. Other sources of insecurity were the ongoing clashes between herders and farmers in central Nigeria and unrest in the southeast stemming from the long-running issue of militants disrupting oil production as well as the resurgence of the Biafran secessionist movement. The latter group in 2017 observed the 50th anniversary of the region's declaration of independence. The 2019 elections. In the run-up to the February 2019 general elections, more than 70 candidates declared their intent to stand for president. Within that crowded field, the two leading candidates were Buhari, again the APC's candidate, and Atiku Abubakar, a seasoned politician who served as vice president under Obasanjo, representing the PDP. The election was originally scheduled for February 16, but, because of logistical problems, it was postponed just hours before it was due to begin and was held a week later, on February 23. Buhari was re-elected, taking 56% of the vote. Abubakar, his nearest challenger, won 41%. He was inaugurated for his second term on May 29, 2019.